everybody? Recording live from somewhere. This is Zach, couples with episode number 126 of the Movement Debrief. And today, folks, we're going to breathe out. We're going to breathe in. You'll put your back in it and let your knees bend. Because we're going to talk about all things breathing related. Biomechanics. When should you breathe during exercise? How do you educate people who think breathing is a bunch of BS? These have been questions that I have been asked by the people. They will be answered for the people by this people right here. Fam recognize fam. Without further ado, let's debrief, shall we? The first question comes from Alex. Here's what Alex asks. Hi, Zach. You describe inhalation as a general posterior expansion of the spine to accept depressed abdominal contents, which causes a reduced lumbar lordosis, among other things. However, I've read that inhalation as causing an increased lumbar lordosis due to the diaphragmatic attachments to the anterior spine. The latter makes sense to me given the importance of exhalation in creating an ideal stack. But the concepts you have been describing very much do as well. It would be incredible, I'm sure he said it that way, if you could help me understand this, as I feel like this confusion confounds my ability to understand how the upper and lower parts of the ventral cavity, thorax, abdomen, and pelvis, are functionally linked. Thank you. No, Alex, thank you. Question is, what the heck is the lumbar spine doing during inhalation and exhalation? So here's what I would say the lumbar spine is doing. Let's assume, and obviously this is a poor assumption, but if I have a resting position that is more lordotic in the lumbar spine, for those of you who don't know what lordosis is, basically if you see someone with that deep arch, imagine an arbitrary normal amount of that deep arch in the lower back. In that scenario, the sacrum is nutated, meaning it's tipped forward. Following me so far? Good, I'm happy to hear that. If the sacrum is nutated and the lumbar spine is lordotic, the pelvic floor, in particular the anterior pelvic floor, is going to be more ascended. If the pelvic floor is ascended, the viscera are going to be pushed upward. So that's just at rest, and let's assume that this is a full exhalation. You got residual volume and all that stuff. Life is good. Now, if I need to breathe in, which you need to do at some point unless you want to die, you got to make room for air in the lungs somehow, some way, some shape or form, and you got to be able to pull air into the lungs. So the way that that happens is via this wonderful, sexy muscle called the diaphragm. The diaphragm sits like, thorax up top, abdomen down low. The diaphragm is the partition between those two areas. As you breathe in, the diaphragm is going to descend. As the diaphragm descends, it pushes downward on stuff. The stuff that it pushes downward is your viscera, aka the guts and the goods. If I'm pushing downward and the guts and the goods are moving downward as well, your pelvic floor has to change what it's doing, or your pelvis, I should say, in order to accept that downward pressure that's coming from the viscera. In order for that to happen, I need to increase the relative surface area of the pelvic inlet. The pelvic inlet is the top part of the pelvis, the top hole, so to speak. The way that that happens is by counter-nutating the sacrum, tipping the sacrum back, and anteriorly rotating the innominates. This would be your innominates would be your pelvic bones at the SI joint. These puppies are going to rotate forward. This, if I rotate the innominates forward and spread them apart, is going to increase the relative surface area available on the top part of the pelvis for the viscera to be caught. If your viscera needs to be catch, the pelvic floor you must stretch. So, you're going to do that. Now, we have to ask ourselves, which joint, which area, which location has more relative motion available? Is it the SI joint or is it the lumbosacral complex? Well, I'm glad you asked. At the SI joint, you got about 2 degrees of motion available. Not a lot. Right? So when I move the bones all wild and crazy, like this is not real. It's just a model. The lumbosacral complex in extension has 15 degrees, and with flexion has about 55 degrees. Now here's the question of the day. Which numbers are greater than 2? Is 55 greater than 2? Is 15 greater than 2? Go ahead, write your answers down. If you guessed that the numbers 55 and 15 were more than 2, you would be correct. So, once the 2 degrees of motion is taken up at the SI joint, you got all this other range of motion available. So, the pelvis is going to move as a unit in whatever direction the spine moves. So now we have to ask, what the heck is the lumbar spine doing when I nutate and when I counter-nutate? When I nutate the sacrum, the lumbar spine is going to be more relatively lordotic, or it's going to extend, perhaps we could say. If I counter-nutate the sacrum, the lumbar spine is going to be less lordotic, or it might move into some degree of flexion. Therefore, if the sacrum counter-nutates to make room to catch the downward displacing viscera from the diaphragm descending to pull air in, the lumbar spine has to reduce its lordotic curve or flex to some degree. Now you also have to realize that the amounts might not be much, especially during quiet respiration. And you also have to consider too that I'm getting multi-directional expansion throughout the entire ventral cavity. So when you breathe in, you should have a relative circumferential expansion in the ab wall. Your ribcage should expand as a unit. The pelvis should open up and gap a little bit as a unit. Think like it's expanding in all directions to make room for this increased air volume and the way your body has to change to pull in that air volume. So I would argue that when I breathe in, the lumbar spine has to reduce its lordotic curve in order to accept the viscera. Now, Alex is saying, well, Zach, based on the diaphragmatic attachments, I would think that I would get some lumbar extension. And he's right. If I contract the diaphragm in isolation, there would be some extension occurring in the lumbar spine. And there's a good study that I will link in the show notes, which will be found on zachcouples.com/breathe, that you should check out, that talks about what is the postural function of the diaphragm. A couple things. One, the diaphragm is not acting in isolation. There's other muscles involved. We have to consider what's going on with the pelvic floor and all of these other things. Two, there is a time in which you breathe in that the diaphragm, because of increased concentric contraction, will pull the lumbar spine into extension. That typically happens as the diaphragm descends and goes to flat. Because what you end up seeing is as the diaphragm fully descends, it changes its line of pull on the lower rib cage. What happens is normally, under normal circumstances, as the diaphragm descends, the ribs are going to move outward and upward, the lower rib cage. That would be what we would call the bucket handle action at the ribs. When the diaphragm goes towards flat, the pull of the diaphragm on the lower rib cage changes. It starts to pull inward and compress the rib cage. When that happens, this is when you start to see ribs start to flare out more. So you get the rib cage getting longer, getting bigger anteriorly and posteriorly. When that happens, that's when you start to see an increase in lumbar extension and subsequent lordosis. The difference is when I talk about the lumbar spine reducing its normal lordotic curve, I'm talking normal respiratory mechanics. When you're talking about the lumbar spine extending as the diaphragm contracts, that is more often than not a compensatory mechanics situation. If the diaphragm goes to flat, you have to extend your lumbar spine to take more air in because that's your only option. To summarize your great question, Alex, lumbar spine ought to reduce its lordotic curve when you inhale to make room for the viscera, and that's because lumbar flexion is associated with sacral counternutation, which is needed to catch the guts and the goods. If you see lumbar lordosis increasing when you breathe in, you're dealing with a compensatory mechanics situation. That's because the diaphragm has fully descended and you've had to extend the lumbar spine in order to get air in. The diaphragm has gone towards less of a respiratory role because now I can use accessory muscles, and it's gone more towards a postural role, and its predominant postural function within the body is lumbar extension and increasing lordosis. Great question. The next question comes from Sandra. Here's what Sandra asks. Hey, Zach, I have a question for you. I've been following what you teach, and I know your breathing mechanisms, but something has been bugging me. Uh-oh. When we make an inhalation, our ribs rotate externally, and this is related to spinal extension. But, when we inhale, our spine goes into kyphosis too. Is it possible that extension and kyphotization, that's a dope word, happen at the same time? What am I missing here? Thank you for your time. Amazing question, Sandra. I answered this in the past, but I think I can answer it better now. One, two, I couldn't remember what debrief I did it in. You know, I'm kind of like Mad Lib. I don't usually, well, actually, that's not true. I do listen to them afterwards, but I don't remember the content. But here's what's going on. The answer has to do with location in the thoracic spine. And when we're talking location, we have to talk about the function of the intercostal muscles. We have to ask ourselves, when I take a breath of air in, what intercostal muscles are active? What are concentrically contracting in order to help me pull air in? This has to do predominantly not so much with the actual muscles, but the location of those muscles. So it's the intercostal muscles have actually been a little bit of a contention point in anatomy in terms of what their role is. But the OG himself, Andre de Troyer, laid out a pretty comprehensive article that I'll link in the show notes that you should definitely check out because it goes into the function of these intercostal muscles and when they work. The two areas that we have to focus on when we're discussing inhalation are the sternal intercostals, and these are called the peristernal intercostals, and the dorsal rostral intercostals, which is, I believe, the upper 6 ribs. Those are the two intercostal locations that are active during inhalation. They help you pull air into the chest wall. Now we have to ask if those two muscles are active. If I got stuff on the lower front half of the sternum being concentric during inhalation, I got stuff in my upper back being concentric during inhalation, what is going to be the net motion happening in the thoracic spine? If the peristernal intercostals are concentric, that's going to cause the pump handle action at the sternum to occur. What the pump handle action is the ribcage moving anteriorly and superiorly during inhalation. If I move the ribcage anteriorly and superiorly during inhalation, the location of the spine on the opposite side of the body, aka the posterior aspect of the rib cage, is going to shift. So what will happen is you'll have the front ribs moving outward and upward, but then there will be a reduction of the thoracic curve as I tip outward and upward. That's where you're going to get some degree of thoracic extension in the lower part of the rib cage. So as I breathe in, anterior superior action of the front of the sternum, reduction of thoracic curve in the lower part of the rib cage. And that would be, by lower part, I'm saying where the true ribs most likely attach. So there's one piece. But we have this other situation happening in the dorsal rostral intercostals, because those muscles are also active during inhalation. And these are like the upper 4 to 6 ribs. When those muscles contract and I breathe in, you get posterior and superior movement of the rib cage. So if I have posterior and superior movement of the rib cage, you will actually see some degree of an increase in kyphosis in the thoracic spine in that location, which would create a relative flattening on the anterior aspect of the body. These two things, under normal circumstances, happen simultaneously. Now, does that mean that I got like this huge kyphotic curve in the upper back and then I'm, extended AF in the lower part of the thoracic spine? No. These are all relative movements happening at the same time. And realize these are not big movements. In some, when all of those actions happen simultaneously in this wondrous fashion, you get circumferential and multidirectional expansion of the rib cage in total. And you'll see this when you have people do exercises and they can keep the stack. When they breathe in, you just see the whole rib cage get bigger in all directions. And then when they exhale, get smaller in all directions. But if we look at the micro movements in the respective areas, that is what you see that leads to that circumferential expansion. To summarize your great question, Sandra, yes, you do get a combination of reduction of thoracic curve and increase in thoracic curve when you breathe in. Lower part of the front rib cage is going to be more active during inhalation, which reduces the thoracic curve lower. Dorsal rostral area, which is like the upper 4 to 6 ribs, that's going to increase during inhalation, which will reduce the front curvature of the thorax or the rib cage. With both of those actions happening simultaneously, you get circumferential expansion during inhalation, and it is going to look relatively uniform. And that is normal circumstances of breathing. Obviously, with compensatory mechanics, things change. Great question. The next question comes from John. And here's what John asks. Does how you coach breathing change based on if it is an exercise that is intended to influence an exhalation, like hip extension strategy, or an inhalation limitation? Generally, if I am driving inhalation mechanics, flexion, abduction, ER, I want to counter-nutate the sacrum. When I'm going into those movements, I'll breathe in because that's going to help reinforce the mechanics. So let's use a squat as an example. As I'm descending into the squat, I might coach an inhale. Obviously, this changes if we're talking about you're lifting something heavy, you're going to do a Valsalva. But let's just say I'm using a squat and I want to maximize my mobility. During the inhalation component of the squat, flexion, abduction, ER, I will breathe in. During the exhalation component of the squat, extension, adduction, internal rotation, like as I'm coming up, I will breathe out. Now, if you've read some of my, or checked out some of my debriefs in the past, you'll know that, and also if you followed some of Bill Hartman's work, you'll know that there is a relative change of inhalation, exhalation, and inhalation mechanics, or you get different rotations happening through the arc of the squat. Would you breathe in from certain ranges, breathe out, and then breathe in again? You totally could, but from a practical standpoint, there's just a lot of moving parts going on with that. You got to look at our clients. Most of them, they might not care all that much about breathing in specific ways unless you're one of my clients because that's the people who I attract. So I don't think you have to get that fancy. I would look at generalities. And for this, if your goal is to improve inhalation mechanics, flexion, abduction, ER stuff, and you're driving your body into those positions, I would breathe in during that situation. If you're driving more extension, adduction, and internal rotation mechanics, I would breathe out during those situations. Another example could be like an RDL. You might breathe in as you go into relative hip flexion, but then breathe out as you go into hip extension. And that's really about as far and as fancy as I get it. So match the breathing mechanics with whatever you're trying to drive. Inhalation is associated with flexion, abduction, ER. Exhalation is associated with extension, adduction, and IR. Add a little extra respiratory sauce if you want to maximize your movement gains. Good question. The next question comes from Sham, my good friend Sham. Here's what Sham asks. Hey, Zach, I was wondering if you could do an episode regarding when to breathe to bias different expansion strategies for some upper body weight room exercises. Pull-ups, chest-supported rows, incline presses, alternating rows / presses, one-arm pull-downs, if you haven't already. Thanks. Well, Sham, I haven't already, or at least I didn't as comprehensive as I'm going to now. So let's go through each of the activities that Sham has mentioned, and we'll go through the full cycle. Let's start with a pull-up. Boom, I'm going to set myself up in a dead hang. I wasn't sure if I had the armpit sweat because it's a little hot in here. I'm in the dead hang of the pull-up. I could argue breathing in or breathing out in either of those situations. Both are going to influence relative bucket handle mechanics. If I let out a full exhale, I will do a great job of closing the bucket handle. So that's great for a wide infrasternal angle. If I exhale, keep my ab tension, and inhale at the bottom, that could totes my goats get me more bucket handle for someone like a narrow infrasternal angle. Also, when I'm overhead, you're going to get some pump handle expansion. If you can keep the stack, you may get a little bit of upper back expansion. But because when you're in a dead hang of a pull-up, you are in relative IR at the humerus. Why? Your elbows are flaring out generally, especially if I'm doing an overhand grip. That will drive more air into the front side of the body. That's just the start. If you're pulling and you go chest to bar, which is how I like my pull-ups, as the scaps are getting more downwardly rotated and they're retracted, that's going to allow more air in the front. So if you breathe into the top part of the pull-up, you will get more pump handle mechanics. Now, one issue with this, if you're doing this under heavy load, or you're like me and 177 pounds is heavy load for you because you're weak, that may lead to increased compressive or concentric bias throughout the body, and it might not be the best move for you to get air in. Because if you need to generate a lot of tension or produce a lot of force to perform the task, you're going to have more concentric bias. And that's going to reduce the amount of airflow that you're going to get. That's pretty normal. You want that to produce force. You could use a pull-up to bias air into certain parts of the rib cage, but it might not be your go-to reset. Let's go into a chest-supported row next. Chest-supported row is predominantly going to be pump handle bias, and normally that's because you're at 90 degrees-ish of shoulder flexion. When you're at 90 degrees of shoulder flexion, based on the scapular positioning, check the reaching theory and practice debrief that I'll link in the show notes. But that's going to create external rotation of the scaps. When you got external rotation of the scaps, that's going to reduce air going in the back and increase air going in the front. If you breathe in at the start, you're going to get some expansion in the front, but less so than if you take your breath of air in with the scaps pulled together. That's going to bias even more air into the front. Now here's the cool thing. If you do one side at a time, maybe you don't got the fancy chest-supported row machine. Like I don't have that. I haven't had one in a while. I used to like them. But if you're doing one side at a time, you can actually drive some degree of rotation in the trunk. Now, you got to be thinking, well, Zach, I remember that one debrief you shared a long time ago, and when you were talking about that, you had to have some expansion on the front side of one side of the rib cage and then posterior expansion on the opposite side to drive rotation. But you just said this is more pump handle bias. If I'm pump handling on both sides, how can I rotate? The answer is degrees. If, let's say I'm rowing with my left arm, there's going to be more pump handle on the left side, but there's going to be less pump handle relative to the left on the right. Because I have this gradient, that's going to actually drive some rotation. And the way I would be rotating would actually be, wow, this is interesting, would actually be relatively to the right in terms of the spine. And the reason why that is because wherever I'm getting posterior expansion, which in this case would be more on the right, the thoracic spine would actually rotate that direction. Because when I expand posteriorly, the spinous processes are going to move to the right. So you'd actually get more posterior expansion on the right side, which is kind of cool. But this would be, also think about this too, right? Because I am getting some degree of pump handle on both sides, because you're seeing, right? Well, Zach, as you're pulling that way, your body's going to the left. Yes, and that has to be because what happens is because I've pump handled on both sides, I'm getting a leftward orientation of my thorax, and then if I breathe in this position, I would be right moving or rotating to the right from a leftward starting point. Just like I could extend my elbow, hang on, pow, there we go. I could extend my elbow, and right now, if I stop, you look at me, and it's like, well, Zach, your elbow's flexed, what the heck's going on? Well, this is true, but the movement itself that's occurring is towards extension. When I'm in this position on the row, where my left arm's pulling, my right arm's reaching, it looks like I'm rotating to the left, but if I breathe here, I'm actually driving rotation to the right. So that would be the long and the short example with chest-supported row. So it's generally a pump handle bias, but if you do unilateral actions, you will get some rotation happening. Usually the rotation is going to be oriented towards one direction and then attempting to rotate to the opposite direction, even though it might not drive full visual rotation that way. Next, we got incline presses. I love incline presses. Incline presses are also pump handle bias. Why? When I'm at an incline, I'm going relatively overhead, and let's just say we start with a low incline. 60 to 120 degrees of shoulder flexion are going to drive more air into the front. So if I'm at an incline press, that's going to drive more air in the front. If I'm doing alternating dumbbell style, that's going to do similar rotation things as we saw with the chest-supported row. Cool thing is the higher you go up, the more of an incline that you get, the more shoulder flexion you drive, the more expansion is going to be allowed in the dorsal rostral area, T2, T4, T5, 6, somewhere around there. So you will actually get more upper posterior expansion the higher you go. That's going to drive a greater amount of rotation than what we saw with the chest-supported row. And it will actually create a better gradient than the chest-supported row. Because as I get into that overhead position, now I'm allowing for more posterior expansion to happen, which means you drive more relative rotation from a respiratory perspective. If you're doing some heavy-ass incline presses and you're doing it bilaterally, that's going to be more concentric in nature. You need it to move the weights, so the rotational amounts will likely be less. But you could still argue driving some pump handle, and then as you go closer to overhead or even an Arnold press, you're likely going to get more upper back expansion, T2, T4 area. One arm pull downs. Ooh, I love these. And I'm going to link in the show notes, and I'm going to try actually to, in the show notes, just because I want to over deliver for you fine folks, like have a little like blog summary on each of these points. But with one arm pull downs, very similar to the chin up, but you can drive more air with these exercises, which I really like. And you got to try out this rib shake pull down that I've been messing with some clients. It's money. It's money. It leads to some nice movement changes. If you're starting at the top and you breathe in, that's going to drive more bucket handle mechanics, which is really good, especially if you throw any side bending into the mix. You'll also get some A to P expansion in the upper thorax, depending on where your arm rotation is. If your elbow's pointing out, it's going to be more air in the front. If you're more supinated and your arm is pointing inward or your elbow's pointing inward, that's going to drive more air in the back. Then as I pull down, that can help you close the bucket handle. Great for you wide infrasternal angle folks on that side. And here's the cool thing, if you're doing something on the opposite side, maybe I'm doing an alternating pull down and I breathe in, you can drive more bucket handle expansion on the opposite side. I close down one side, open up the other, you get air going into those areas. And then same thing, if I'm more internally rotated at the arm, that's going to drive more air in the front. If I'm more externally rotated, that's going to drive more air in the back. And those would be all the exercises that Sham had mentioned. To give you a brief summary, I won't go into specific moves, but you just got to think about where your arms are. If your scaps are getting pulled back, rows, you're doing an eccentric on a press, that's going to drive more air in the front. If you're reaching more forward, you're going maybe lower, that will drive relative air in the back, but you still might get some air in the front depending on the angle that you're reaching at. Check out the reaching debrief that I'll link in the show notes. If I go overhead, I will get more expansion in the upper segments of the rib cage. And anytime I go overhead and I breathe in and breathe out, that can also influence bucket handle mechanics. The last question comes from Chris. Here's what Chris asks. Right now, I'm diving into the whole breathing, biomechanics, and movement information you provide. I live in Germany, where nobody really knows shit about the stuff you talk about. A lot of people are very critical of the concepts that I play around with. Do you have any advice on how to get clients and other coaches to come to the light side? Also, can you share some studies that can help me back up the stuff I'm talking about, especially some of the pelvic movements during breathing, squatting, hinging, movement variability, etc. People always want to see the evidence. So it would be nice to just stuff some studies down their throat so that I can keep learning in peace. Also, I kind of want to know that what you're talking about is actually true. Keep doing what you're doing. Lots of love from Germany. Chris. Chris, this is a really good question, man. And I feel for you. It can be really tough when you are doing something that deviates from the normal standard of care. And you'll be branded as a heretic and all that. And I think that's just because people in general are resistant to change of any kind. It's hard, especially when you are hit with something that goes against perhaps something that you hold near and dear. I mean, you have to think about it from their perspective. They might have done things the way that they've done for an extended period of time, and they have their own framework and thought process. And if they are challenged by something, that can elicit cognitive dissonance. And when you have cognitive dissonance and you feel threatened by, oh, this is something that is near and dear to my heart, of course you're going to push back. So I totally get why they would react this way. 1. 2, if you got someone who wants to see evidence for what they're doing or what you're doing, they probably also care about their clients and what they want to do, and they want to make sure that they're establishing best practice. So I totally think that this is justified. If you need research, I will link my references page on the show notes that I use for Human Matrix, my seminar. All of my references are there, so don't hesitate to share that with them. And it's just zachcouples.com/references. Check that out. You'll have a lot of stuff to go into. And, is what I'm doing true? I don't know if we know that. I don't know if we can ever know the truth in science, because that implies that this is a definitive thing. And the nice thing about science is it can always change, and it should change. I'm hoping, when I look at the stuff that I did last year, I shudder because, wow, that was stupid. I like how I'm doing it now, and I hope to do that in the future. If I look back into what I did 5 years ago, yeesh, should send apology letters to all my clients every year. So there is nothing that's true about this, and even though what I do, it seems to be effective for my clients and it resonates well with me. And there's there's definitely some confirmation bias in things that I hold near and dear to my heart because I'm just as guilty as these folks. But if I found a better way, I'd like to think that I would change, and I would be open to that. But how do you educate them? You could definitely throw the research studies at them. Are they going to read it? No. I think the best ways to do this is to find some common language and find some agreement points with the people who you're talking to. Because if you can find what principles are fundamental between you two, then I think it's much easier to have these conversations. So some principles that the people who you're working with may have in common. You could ask them, what do you think about intra-abdominal pressure? And ask them, like, don't try to pontificate about them, because if you are coming in full bore about whatever it is that you want to do, I generally find it being more successful if you seek understanding of them first and where they're coming from. That's going to do a couple things for you. One is going to better allow you to have a conversation with that person, so you can kind of meet them where they're at. You're almost learning their language and you're learning their story. It's going to make them less defensive because they see that, oh wow, Chris, he's a good dude. He wants to know what I'm thinking. And three, the better you understand their argument, the easier it's going to be to come at them wherever their pitfalls are. And maybe, how about this, Chris? This could be a wild concept. Maybe you take time to understand what they're saying and they actually change your mind. And then you are doing something different. So you could only get better by having these conversations with them. So the first thing you want to do, first and foremost, is seek understanding of what these people are trying to say and where they're coming from. Do that first. Find the common points. Maybe it's intra-abdominal pressure. Then you could talk about your perspective. Well, with intra-abdominal pressure, what goes into that? Well, did you know that if I have a reduction of intrathoracic pressure, that it can actually increase intra-abdominal pressure in a negative manner? Well, how would I get a negative alteration of intrathoracic pressure? Because actually, if you look at some of the IAP research, those should be kind of the same, and they should be able to increase and decrease simultaneously. Well, if you have any restrictions in the ribcage dynamics, that's going to change how things pressurize. That might actually increase intra-abdominal pressure in a negative degree in the abs. So you could just start simply with something like that. From a squat, because this is something that I've succeeded and failed with when we're talking about squat mechanics, because I coach squatting a bit differently than a lot of people do. But I would ask these people, how do you differentiate a squat versus a deadlift? What is knee dominance? What is hip dominance? And I would be curious to see what they would say. Because maybe, you get those talking points and you can say, well, okay, what has to happen specifically at the pelvis to make that the case? And so it's really just about having good conversations and not seeking to change their mind, but seeking to understand where they're coming from and seeing where you can bridge the gap with talking to them about that. Because I think that's one issue that we have, especially on social media, is we can't have those face-to-face conversations, because really it's just about saying whatever you believe, and then you can't have the nuances of conversation. You can't seek understanding. You can't have common ground. You can't have those nonverbal tics. You can't appreciate all that stuff. And so I think, Chris, in your case, you are in a unique and useful situation because you can have those conversations. And also, too, Chris, I would ask them, this is actually a good question that I got from Scott Adams, there's a great book called Loser Think that I would strongly encourage you to read, and Win Bigly, because I think these two books would be essential in getting your message. But he has this $1 million question that he asks someone who maybe disagrees with him. He'll say, I want you to tell me in this situation, what is something that I believe about this exercise or activity that you think or that you don't believe? And they might say something, and perhaps they're actually misinterpreting what you're trying to do. And then you can say, well, no, actually, I do believe that we're trying to do this on the squat, or I'm trying to coach this particular exercise in this manner. So you may also have to seek understanding of what they're trying to ask you or why they're challenging you. I think that can be very useful as well to better have a conversation so then both you and the other person can grow and get better. To summarize your amazing, sexy question, Chris, when you're trying to educate others on why this stuff is useful, seek to understand their point first. Really understand where they're coming from. Understand why they have contention points. Ask a bunch of questions before you go vomiting the research articles that I'm going to share with you. Do that first. Really understand their point, because that's either going to change what you're doing, which is good, or that will better help understand where the pitfalls are of their argument so you can better carry on your point. That's piece one. Piece two, find common ground. What areas do you agree with that person? Because if you have those underlying fundamental principles that are the same, they're more likely to be receptive to the last part, which is now you can introduce some of the challenging points. That could be throwing some of the research at these folks. That could be showing them the lens that you're looking at things from a unique perspective. And while I don't know if what I'm doing is true, it has seemed to work pretty well with the people who I work with, but if you need some specific research, I will share that in the show notes. That's a good stopping point for us today. I want to thank all of you beautiful, sexy, outstanding people for tuning in. I hope you are being safe and healthy during this time, because it seems like cases are kicking up a little bit more in a lot of areas. I know in wonderful Nevada we got to wear face masks now in public, and that's mandatory. So I hope you're being safe and healthy. But if you want to learn more from your boy, Big Z, and you thought this was really cool, I want to dive into some of the reaching and all that stuff, go to zachcouples.com. While you're there, subscribe to my newsletter, because I got a gang of free stuff for you. You'll get a free course called Human Matrix Foundations, which goes into the nitty-gritty of the anatomy, the biomechanics, all this stuff that you need to better understand the concepts we talk about. And that's just on the didactic side. But on the practical side, well, Zach, this is cool, but how am I going to use this with my clients? That's where the Common Compensations workbook comes into play. What if I told you there was a way to simplify the movement issues that you see in moves like squats, hinging, pushes, and pulls into just one of two cheating strategies? The Common Compensations workbook will help you work through that. Then you can go through the debriefs, go through my YouTube channel, which just search Zach Couples to find, and you'll be able to better help your clients' movement skills. I also offer some services on that page. I offer movement consultations, which if you toy you're not moving as well as you'd like to, and maybe you want to squat, maybe you can't squat all the way down, you want to learn how to do that, I can walk you through it by taking you through a full evaluation, coaching you on the spot with some activities, and getting all wild and crazy. I also offer mentoring if you want to learn how to do this stuff with your supreme clientele. If you want me to give you some feedback on how you're coaching your clients, or how you're educating people, or having these hard conversations that Chris is talking about, or if you want to get into some internet business similar to me and you'd like some guidance along the way, I can be your guy. Definitely check me out for that. Last thing that I offer is online training, and I'm not going to be taking many more slots. So if you want this, please sign up, because I'm at max capacity, near max capacity. If you want to take these concepts and apply them under a fitness perspective, you want to move better, but you want to get them gains, or you want to drop some fat, or you just want to be able to hike without aches and pains, I can help you with that as well. Definitely sign up for online training. If you want in-person, practical, hands-on coaching, this is all well and good, Zach, but I'm not sure I'm doing these moves right, and I want to make sure that I have a comprehensive model to assess my clients, apply these movement concepts that you're talking about, so we can get people feeling the areas they need to feel, maximize their movement capabilities, and feel good and look good. That's where my seminar, Human Matrix, comes into play. I'm going to be taking all of the necessary steps that are needed to make sure it's safe, social distancing, all that stuff. And maybe we'll get some Human Matrix brand masks. The first one that's coming up for this year, barring that the world kind of heals. August 1st and 2nd in Boston, Massachusetts. That one is selling pretty well. So I hope to see you there. September 12th and 13th, Montreal, Canada. October 3rd and 4th, Ann Arbor, Michigan. November 7th and 8th in Charlotte, North Carolina. November 21st and 22nd in San Diego, California. There are some 2021 dates as well that will be on the main page or on the show notes here. So please check me out. I hope to see you there. I hope that things start to continue to get better so we can have more of those, because I do miss the in-person interaction a bit for sure. Once you've scoured ZachCouples.com, you'll want to check me out on Apple Podcasts and Stitcher. Because guess what, folks? There's 125 other debriefs in there. And, the video quality wasn't great in the early days. You might not want to be there for the Fat Zach time periods, and you might just want to listen to me. That's where Apple Podcasts and Stitcher is there for you. Search the Zach Couples Show. While you're there, leave a review so the fam can keep growing. Social media-wise, I mentioned YouTube, but check me out on Facebook and Twitter. Handle is ZCouples. Of course, I'm on that Instagram, baby, at Zach, Z-A-C, Couples, C-U-P-P-L-E-S. Thank you so much for tuning in. You've been a beautiful, sexy, outstanding audience. I hope that you keep it real, but not to the extent when things go wrong. Stay hungry, stay learning, stay moving, and I'll see you next time. Deuces.